All right, let's go ahead and begin another art brunch presentation, and I hope it will go without too many technical glitches. Seem to be having that to start us off with. Hopefully that has been corrected. Now I'd like to begin, well, actually, I'll just give a brief overview. We started working with this work. We're going to be focusing on it for uh, today and the next two Sundays as well. This wonderful painting that you see here, this is a detail of it. It's called The Mystic Nativity by Sandra Botticelli, and it has baffled, and I would say troubled, many art historians over the centuries, really, due to its religious perspective. It essentially contains two nativity narratives. One is the traditional story of the birth of the Christ child into the world to bring reconciliation between the human world and the spiritual world, but it also contains apocalyptic references, which is essentially about Christ returning to the world to bring lasting peace. Christ's return is a rebirth of sorts, a second nativity. So go ahead and just take about a minute to observe this work. For those of you who weren't with me last week, give it a good once over, observing all the little details. And if you have pen and paper handy or some note-taking apparatus, please take notes.
There was very minor breakup, so we'll see how it goes.
All right. Well, here's Alexandra. She wants to be admitted. Hopefully, we can get her in. She hasn't missed anything, really. To help us review, the painting can really be divided into three sections. So let me go ahead and show you each. Start with the top. There's a golden dome of heaven. It opens above the scene, circled by 12 angels holding olive branches entwined with scrolls, which are hung with crowns. The angels seem almost to dance in jubilation at the birth of Christ, creating an atmosphere of really ecstatic celebration. Now, notice the angels on the roof, those three, they represent faith, charity, and hope. Angels in this entire work are agents of reconciliation and peace. Now, when we go to the middle section, we see the traditional nativity scene unfolds underneath a simple thatched roof. The Virgin Mary kneels in adoration before the Christ child, a very enlarged Christ child, as well as Mary is oversized, along with Joseph. Now, notice Joseph and his strange posture. We asked last week, wondered if he is sleeping or not. Then we always had the ubiquitous ox and donkey present, representing the idea that this message is meant for both Jews and Gentiles, really all humanity. Now, last week we ended with a focus on the shepherd's perspective, tried to emphasize our own humble stance when approaching the idea of spiritual renewal. We're going to embody other figures in this work at the end in a contemplative exercise. But now here's the bottom. The foreground presents the most unusual element. Three pairs of angels and men embrace in a dance-like rhythm, while among their feet winged demons and horned devils scuttle for shelter in the underworld through the cracks in the rocks. This meeting of the divine and human set against the flight of demons illustrates the apocalyptic transformation Botticelli believed was occurring in his time, where the material world would be reconciled to the spiritual world and the era of peace would reign over all. The painting was heavily influenced by the preaching of a radical apocalyptic friar named Girolamo Savonarola. After the death of the great patron of so much art and philosophy we associate with the Renaissance, Lorenzo Magnifico or Lorenzo de' Medici, in 1492, Savonarola essentially took over Florence as far as political influence. He hoped to turn Florence into a new Jerusalem, and called people to give up all luxuries and pagan influences. He employed bands of youths who went around the city to call citizens to lay their mirrors, their silks and furs, their pagan books and art onto a pyre we now know as the bonfire of the vanities. And people did so, including possibly Botticelli himself. So many great books and art up in flames. Boo to this. Go ahead where you are and give a loud boo to the burning of books and art. Go ahead. Say boo as loudly and as nastily as you can because I know you're feeling it. Now, there was another side of Savonarola's message. His radical critique of wealth and repeated calls for economic justice. He attacked tyrants and condemned the church's alliance with the wealthy and powerful at the expense of the poor. His preaching excoriated the rich and powerful who neglected and exploited the poor, calling these elites to account for their complicity in social justice. Savonarola's vision was unambiguous. The Medici family, the de facto rulers of Florence for some 70 plus years, had failed with all their empty, supposedly godless materialism. Savonarola wanted to make Florence the city of God, and he preached that the only path to righteousness was the rejection of material wealth. So his message was revolutionary. Let the rich give to the poor. Let the churches be stripped of their excessive wealth, and let all live in strict observation of God's laws. Now, this was not merely rhetorical flourish. When Savonarola became prior of San Marco Monastery in 1491, he immediately implemented reforms within his own monastery. He demanded that monks give up all of their possessions, which were then sold to raise money for the poor. He led by example, living in a small, poor cell with coarse clothing and simple, scanty food. This commitment to radical poverty stood in stark contrast to the opulence that characterized both secular and religious life in Renaissance Florence. Savonarola's apocalyptic call for Florence to repent and turn back to a more austere and moral life resonated with Sandro Botticelli. At least this appears to be the case, especially based on this painting, which is as much about the second coming of Christ as his birth. When we took a close look at the work last week, the overall message wasn't so appealing at first. But then once we looked at the painting more closely, we developed an affinity for its message, the hope of reconciliation between what is spiritual and what is worldly, between the divine and human, between the profound and the humble. Now, frankly, after my presentation, I found myself asking, are such dichotomies between spiritual and profane, between divine and human, legitimate? Are the lines separating these categories so sharp? I think that's something that we can all think about. Well, today I would like to focus on the Magi as represented in this work and the Christian Nativity tradition as a whole. Who were they? The Magi were simply philosophers from the East, traditionally associated with ancient Persia. Some would call them astrologers or maybe the scientists of their day. Now, this relief you see is one of the earliest depictions of the Magi. We see three of them. Now, there's no specific number given in the biblical accounts. And here they are presenting gifts to the infant Jesus, not the baby Jesus, but the infant. Jesus, who eagerly accepts those gifts. And as you know, the gifts are gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and these have great symbolic value. The gold represents Christ as king. The frankincense, which is used in temple worship, refers to Jesus' divinity and the need to worship him. And the myrrh is used for embalming. So it is a reference that we are mortal and must suffer and die, and so must Christ as well. Let's flash forward to the Renaissance and the two artists who were the mentors of Sandro Botticelli, Fra Angelico and Fra Filippo Lippi. They joined forces to create this work, The Adoration of the Magi, in the middle of the 15th century. What immediately stands out, I think, to most is the pomp and circumstance of the procession. If we zoom in some, the three magi are dressed like wealthy merchants or even royalty. And they are accompanied by this massive entourage of attendants, well dressed as well. This looks like a sacred pilgrimage of wealthy seekers, desperate to encounter the divine. Now, when patrons commissioned adoration scenes with the Magi dressed in spectacular clothes and presenting gifts in elaborate goldsmith vessels, they were celebrating wealth as a sign of God's favor, as well as positioning themselves as latter-day Magi, wise, devout, and prosperous. Pragmatically speaking, this was great PR for the wealthy elites. Savonarola's attack on this viewpoint and this culture was not merely spiritual, it was profoundly social and economic. He challenged the fundamental assumptions of Florentine society about the relationship between wealth and virtue. Now, a few other notable details. Notice that Joseph is fully alert in this work, acknowledging the Magi's presence. He looks very different in the mystic Nativity. Now, if we move up the painting, we immediately notice the massive-sized peacocks on the roof of the stable. In Renaissance art, peacocks symbolize immortality, resurrection, and paradise. You see, in the ancient world, there was a common belief that a peacock's flesh did not decay, which linked the bird to Christ's resurrection and eternal life. I don't know how they got this idea that peacock's flesh doesn't decay. Some of you may know. You can type it up in the chat if you would. Now, just to the left of the peacocks, we see 5 barely clad young men or boys. Do you see them? They're kind of tiny. Many scholars believe they are symbolic representations of the passing away of the pagan world of Europe to make room for the Christian faith. But notice the ruins of the classical building they are standing on. The passing away of the Greco-Roman world, along with its philosophies and religions. That seems to be the reference. But these symbols also acknowledge the classical world's real influence on the Christian faith. Especially during the Renaissance, this belief was widespread. Plato was considered a prophet by early church leaders, a prophet who predicted the coming of Christ as the fulfillment of all classical philosophies. Now, here is one of Botticelli's earlier versions of the story. Again, the setting is among ruins of the classical world. There's not as massive of an entourage, but the Magi and their attendants are still dressed in the most expensive attire available at the time. The 3 Magi are actually represented by Medici family members who are likely patrons of the work. The Medici family, headed by Cosimo de' Medici, the grandfather of Lorenzo the Magnificent, they basically funded the Italian Renaissance. Not only its art, but its ideas by acquiring ancient manuscripts and funding scholars and libraries. Zooming in closer, we get a better look at the richly embroidered and jeweled garments of the Magi. The one at the Virgin's feet is Cosimo de' Medici. He wears a richly jeweled and embroidered outfit, while another is swathed in an ermine-trimmed red cloak. That's his son. While another is swathed in opulent, I guess that is silk, white silk with gold band around the arm. All the Medici family depicted in this work embody the connection between earthly wealth and spiritual devotion that characterized Florentine religious art of the period. Now, on the far right, the young man in the tan cloak is Botticelli himself. And notice in this work, Joseph again, he appears semi-awake this time. Well, that reflects the fact that in the biblical narrative, Joseph receives dreams about the identity of the coming Christ child to relieve his concerns about his young wife somehow getting pregnant without him. Now, personally, I would need more than a couple of dreams to feel better about such a situation. Now, a few years after he completed this work, he painted this version, which resides in the National Gallery in DC. So if you go with me on the art pilgrimage, you'll see it. Again, we have the classical architecture in decay as the setting, suggesting a continuity between ancient and Christian philosophy. The adoration of the Magi was a very popular subject of art in Florence for the obvious reasons of the Medici family and so many wealthy families there. They were all members of religious confraternities that were dedicated to the Magi. Every 5 years, the wealthy members of this fraternity took part in a pageant celebrating the journey of the Magi to Bethlehem. Hundreds took part in the long parade through the streets of Florence. I imagine it was like the Macy's Day Parade, but instead of giant floats, there were processions of Medici family members clothed in fine cloth and jewels and riding on camels. I'm going to zoom in here. Notice the Magi on the far left with the crown on his head. By this time, the Magi have become wealthy and powerful kings in the tradition. No wonder the wealthy families of Florence felt kinship with the Magi and wanted the population of the city to know that God had favored them with wealth, as long as they showered proper devotion to the church. So they were always present at traditional religious festivals. Notice how Joseph has been transformed. He is now smiling broadly, the proud father. Again, that's going to change once Botticelli has been influenced by the religious fervor enveloping Florence under the influence of Savonarola, some 15 to 20 years after this work was made. Now, this particular version of the Adoration of the Magi was begun by Sandro Botticelli not long before the mystic Nativities. It's dated around 1500. However, Botticelli did not complete it. He only drew in all the figures and the landscape in a sepia hue. Artists during the 16th century came along and added colors to the figures in the foreground. Notice that? Now take a look at the setting now, how it is radically changed. These are not the ruins of the classical world anymore, as if he's telling us that the Christian faith owes nothing to ancient classical art or philosophy or culture. Botticelli has rid the scene of such references. Now, Botticelli maintains the large throngs of people typical of Magi works, but this is less about the pomp and pageantry of the scene. It's more about spiritual devotion. I mean, notice the postures of the people's hands and bodies, revealing a reverence and contemplation on the divine mystery before them. Take a good look again at Joseph. His eyes are barely open. He looks troubled and a bit sleepy. That gesture of his head resting on his hand is also a reference to his confusion and temptation to doubt whether God is behind this miraculous event. Now, there are a couple of figures just to the left of Joseph that I want to focus on. You can see one of them pointing. The individual pointing whose green cloak is wrapped around another figure. Notice that? Some have argued that the pointing figure represents Savonarola, while the one he is speaking to is Lorenzo de' Medici. If that is the case, and there's no consensus in the art world about it, then in this work, Botticelli is calling the entire Medici family to renounce their ways of extravagant living and instead turn to a humble life of service to the faith. Now, this message bothers me a little because the Medici family did give extravagantly to the church and they funded massive civic projects aiding the people of the city. Botticelli, the artist, came along after Cosimo de' Medici, that you see again, had passed away, but he certainly was well aware of Cosimo's extravagant spending for the church, for various civic projects, and of course, for great art. And when Cosimo's grandson Lorenzo took over the family business, he calculated that the family had spent around 663,000 florins on the arts and civic projects. Now, AI research said, that I conducted, said this is equivalent to somewhere, and this is a vast amount here, 100 to $600 million in today's economy, somewhere in there. Likely $500 million they spent. Let me offer again a quote that some of you are familiar with because I've put it in other art brunches. This is from Cosimo, and hopefully it'll offer some context. He said, "All those things, meaning works of art, have given me the greatest satisfaction and contentment because they are not only for the honor of God, but are likewise for my own remembrance. For 50 years, I have done nothing else but earn money and spend money. And it became clear that spending money gives me greater pleasure than earning it." So Cosimo was no hoarder of money, no miser who only spent it on luxuries for himself. He spent extravagantly in ways that benefited Florence and its people. However, the fact is that simply having massive wealth still raises a problem, I think, for most of us, if we're honest. It's widely recognized that great economic disparity lends to resentment and societal instability. A real enmity always seems to develop between the masses and those at the very, very top of the economic ladder. We see that vividly play out in our political talk today. Vast economic equality doesn't appear to be healthy for societies that, more than anything, want peace and harmony among all of its citizens. So let's return to our work and try to bring some more clarity to all these ideas. Let me ask you, is there anything wrong with having great wealth? If you have pen and paper or a note-taking device, please go ahead and jot down your ideas, your thoughts. Anything wrong with having great wealth? What is, in your opinion, the proper use of wealth? Remember that we may not have Medici-size wealth, but compared to the rest of the world, we are in the top 2, 3%. I'm holding in my hand right now an iPhone, a supercomputer that fits in the palm of my hand, giving me access to more knowledge than I will ever need. I'm not rich by Medici standards, but I am quite rich compared to 99% of the world. And so I think when asking these questions, we need to remember resentment is the result of a comparison game. Now, as we get closer to the Holy Family, the shepherds and the Magi, I'd like you to notice the line and forms Botticelli has chosen. Notice the curve of the shepherd's posture and how they reflect the same posture as Mary. Now look on the other side at the Magi and how they reflect the posture of Joseph. An angel's outstretched arm nearly touches Joseph, directing the Magi's attention as much to him as the Christ child. So, what is Botticelli trying to tell us? Well, the Magi are supposedly very wise men, yet they are identified with a perplexed Joseph who must rely on divine understanding rather than human logic and knowledge. What makes this painting particularly striking is Botticelli's radical choice to dress the Magi in simple, humble clothing, I'd say, nearly indistinguishable from that of the shepherds. This artistic decision breaks sharply with the conventions established by Botticelli's contemporaries and his own earlier works. Gone are the richly jeweled and embroidered outfits, the ermine-trimmed cloaks, the spectacular pieces of goldsmith work containing their three gifts. Instead, these magi appear in plain robes that could belong to any humble pilgrim or peasant. There is no distinction of rank or wealth in their appearance. And also, where is the gold, the frankincense, the myrrh? These magi kneel before the Christ child not as earthly kings displaying their magnificence, but as simple worshipers offering their lives instead without offering expensive gifts. This departure from convention is so complete that viewers familiar only with traditional Renaissance representations might not immediately recognize these figures on the left as magi at all. Only their position in the composition and the context of the nativity scene identify them as indeed the wise men from the East. What makes this treatment even more remarkable is that Botticelli places the simply dressed magi on the same visual and spiritual level as the shepherds. As you already know, the shepherds represent the poor and humble of society, while the magi supposedly represent wisdom, wealth, and power. By dressing the magi in clothes identical to Mary and Joseph, and not all that different from the shepherds, Botticelli erases this social hierarchy. The painting suggests that in the true Christian tradition, earthly distinctions of wealth and status become meaningless. This is a true image of socioeconomic equality. And this visual leveling directly reflects Savonarola's social theology. The friar had preached that true Christianity required abandoning the pursuit of wealth and embracing poverty. He had attacked the alliance between the church and the wealthy at the expense of the poor. In Botticelli's painting, we see this teaching made visual. The Magi have stripped themselves of their royal trappings and stand before Christ as humble supplicants, no different from the poorest shepherd. Well, I'm curious, what do you think of Savonarola now, from the time you booed him to this point? This work reflects Savonarola's teaching that Florence would become great not through accumulating riches, but through spiritual transformation. The apparent equality between magi and shepherds illustrates the social justice message that Savonarola preached. The rich must give to the poor, not merely as charity, but as a recognition of fundamental human equality. And in this painting, this ideal is achieved. Well, someone at the First Congregational Church during our in-person meeting last week asked me to show some modern works related to the ideas in mystic nativity. So I'll introduce one, again, an Italian artist who painted the Adoration of the Magi. Gaetano Previati set his Adoration of the Magi at the sea. The sea, Bethlehem, as you know, or probably know, is not next to the sea. Now, I am a sea person, so I was drawn to this work, which subverts traditional nativity images. And I believe Botticelli's mystic Nativity inspired this artist. If the Renaissance artist can radically reinterpret the Nativity to meet his current culture's needs, well, then so can Previati in the late 19th century. Previati was known for his dreamlike symbolic art, and this style reinterprets traditional Christian themes in a mystical, human, and visionary key. Rather than using the conventional stable or ruined classical buildings, Previati employed the expansive seaside horizon. Why did he do this? Perhaps to emphasize the universality of the message. The sea, with its vastness, may symbolize the global scale of Christ's birth and the Christian message of universal redemption, which was to spread across the world. But I also think Previati used the seaside setting to enhance the atmosphere of the work. The open sky and horizon allowed Previati to offer a painting with light and reflection, creating a dramatic, ethereal atmosphere that blends the figures with the landscape. Let's go ahead and wrap this up. Botticelli's decision to dress the Magi in simple clothes like the shepherds in the mystic Nativity represents one of the most radical departures from convention in Renaissance religious painting. This artistic choice directly reflects the Friar Savonarola's teachings on the need for the wealthy to give to the poor and to abandon the pursuit of material display in favor of spiritual devotion. Where traditional Renaissance depictions, including Botticelli's own earlier works, have portrayed the Magi as magnificent kings dressed in luxurious clothing, displaying the finest examples of goldsmith work and exotic textiles. The mystic Nativity presents humble worshipers whose plain dress makes them indistinguishable from the poorest members of society. Through this visual leveling, social hierarchies based on wealth are dissolved. The painting stands as evidence of the profound crisis of conscience that Savonarola's preaching provoked in Botticelli. Now, I personally believe that the artist identified with Joseph. And the very reason we do not see Joseph's face in this work is because it would have been a self-portrait of Botticelli. The great artist who had created some of the most sensuous and worldly images of the Renaissance has stripped away all earthly splendor from his Magi in this work, suggesting that true wisdom and true power are spiritual rather than material qualities. This painting then challenges not just artistic convention, but the fundamental values of Renaissance society and, frankly, of our own. The mystic Nativity asks us to imagine a different kind of Renaissance and a different kind of 21st century. One in which wealth is recognized as a spiritual danger rather than a divine blessing, in which the rich acknowledge their obligation to the poor, and in which material display is abandoned in favor of humble devotion. But let's also be real and honest. This utopian vision has never been realized, and when it has been attempted, catastrophe and death has been the result. Well, be that as it may, Botticelli's simply dressed Magi continue to provoke us by posing uncomfortable questions. So to open up our Q&A, I'd like to ask you, what about our own wealth and resources and how we use it? What questions about that does this painting provoke in you? I'm very curious. And also, as you try to answer that, I'd like you to remember my definition of wealth is having freedom and resources to accomplish a significant goal. And it's significant because it's important to you. That's the only reason it needs in order to be significant.